Hello everyone, so in this video we are going to create this invoice generator application. As you can see, it looks super simple, but we also have the preview and then we can download the PDF, right? So let's go back to the edit. This is the invoice number. Of course, you can always update the value. You can change the date right here to whatever the date you want. And then for the from/to right here, I'm going to do my name. And then my client name is John and my email is @mail.com. It should be at gmail.com. And then my client name, for example, john@mail.com. Right, for the description of the item inside this invoice, I'm going to do portfolio website, portfolio, the quantity is 1, the rate is, for example, $99. Let's add another item. As you can see, the subtotal, the text, and the total will update it automatically. Let's do website, and then here I'm going to say 55. As you can see, it's updated, right? Super cool. I can do like 155, for example. And also, as you can see, for example, on this quantity, if I remove that, right, if I click outside the quantity input field, it should be becoming 1 for the default value. That's the on blur props happen basically in here. And then for the tax rate, I'm going to do like 9%, right? As you can see, we have this number 276. So let's go to preview. Before I show you the download PDF functionality, let me show you first the preview, because on this documentation, I'm going to show you the step-by-step how to create the PDF with preview like this. So if I change something on the code on the PDF generator in here, it basically will show the preview right here. It's better that if we have preview before we download the PDF, right? So if the preview of the PDF I disable, because that's just for development mode. Now, as you can see, if I click download PDF, it will download the PDF file, and this is the result, right? This is basically PDF, super cool. And we are going to use this jsPDF package. As you can see, this is super popular, right? So yep, that's what we're going to learn in this video, and hopefully this is helpful, and let's get started. All right, so let's generate a brand new Next.js application. I'm going to call this Invoice Generator App. Let's hit enter. TypeScript, absolutely, I'm going to do yes, then yes. Talent CSS, yes. Source directory, I'm going to say no. App Router, yes. Turbo Pack, I'm going to say yes. Import alias, I'm going to say no. Okay, so now let's cd to the Invoice Generator app and open it into Visual Studio Code. So first I'm going to install the shadcn. So let's go to shadcn documentation, go to Next.js, and just copy this command right here. npx shadcn add letters init and hit enter. I'm going to use neutral for the base color. As you can see, now we have the components.json file. Here we go. And also we have the lib folders util file right here. Super nice. So now let's try to run it npm run dev. Let's try to create now the UI, really simple UI for the invoice generator. So first I'm going to open the localhost 3000, and then we are going to open the page.tsx, which is the home of this Next.js, right? So I just want to remove all this div. This is just really simple application, so I just want to change this page.tsx to the client component and try to write the state in here. So the state is basically corresponding to show the preview and the form of the invoice, right? And in here, I'm going to check if the show preview is true. I'm going to render component that will show the invoice preview in here. So let's create the component invoice preview. I'm going to put that inside the components folder. And inside that, let's create invoice preview.tsx like this. Let's do RFC, change that to invoice preview. Okay, so now we can just import that right here. Return, and then invoice preview. Save that. Let's take a look. If the show preview, I'm going to setting that to true. Now we should see the invoice preview component should be rendered. So for this div, I'm going to add this class name. Class name set equals to minimal height to screen, and the background gray 5D, and the padding is 4. And also inside that, I have another div that have class name. Maximal width, I'm gonna setting that to 4XL and MX auto to make this maximal width into the center. And inside of that, I'm going to put the title and the description. Inside another div as well, I'm going to put class name, display flex, justify between, item center, margin bottom to 6. Inside in here, basically we have the title, which is inside the heading 1. And also we have the p tag for the description of the app, right? So I'm going to call this invoice generator, and for the description, I'm going to say create professional invoice quickly. On the heading 1, let's try to put class name, text to XL, font bold, and also for the description here, I'm going to say class name into text gray 600. Save that, let's take a look. Right, this is going to be the title and the description. Super simple. Still inside the justify between, because I'm going to put this div into the left side, and also another div right here, which is the button on the right side. So I believe that we don't really yet import the button component from the shadcn. So let's do npx shadcn add lattice add button component. And now we can just import the button from the add component /UI/button, and eyes is basically icon from Lucid React. So now as you can see, if I click the button eyes preview in here, it should be change the preview state into true. So let's take a look. I'm going to refresh just to make sure we see this button here. And here we go. As you can see, we have this preview button. When I click that, now we're on the invoice preview. And after the display flex justify between in here, under that, I'm going to put another component called invoice form. So we don't yet have this component. So let's try to create that inside the components folder. So here I'm going to say invoice-form.tsx. Let's do RFC, change the name to invoice form. Let's try to just import it right here. Here we go. So now we should see the invoice form. When we on the show preview false, right? This is the invoice form. So basically inside the invoice form component, I'm going to render some component. So let's try to just copy and paste. As you can see here, in here basically we have 4 components that render inside the invoice form component. We have basic detail, context detail, items list, and tags and totals. So we need to create basically the file. So first for the basic details, let's go basic details.tsx, and let's create the contact details.tsx. Also, we need to create the item list. Now let's create the tags and totals. Let's go to basic details and we can do RFC, change the component name to basic details like this, save that. Go to contact details, we can do RFC. We can change the component to contact details with capital C and D, and also just close this one. For the item list, we can do that as well. Item list like this. And for the tags and total, RFC, tags and totals. All right, so now just make sure we import all the component here. There's no error, super nice. Save that, and let's try to take a look what we have on the browser. As you can see, we have basic details, contact details, items details, tags and totals. So as you can see, this is the invoice detail from the final project. This is basically wrapping inside a cart component from the shadcn UI. So we need to search for the cart component, and then let's try to install that. Here I'm going to see CLI, copy that, and then go back to the terminal, just hit enter right here. So the way we using cart is super simple. First, I'm going to copy all of this, right? The import statement on the top. And then I'm going to just copy everything in here and just paste that as a return right here. So let's do npm run dev. Let's take a look at the result on the localhost 3000 here. So now as you can see, we have this card with title, content, and footer. Let's go back in here, and then basically for the title, I'm going to change that. I'm going to do invoice details in here, and description, I just want to remove it. Action, I just want to remove that. And for the cart content here, we can basically add class name. So I'm going to do class name. As you can see on the final project, basically we have 2 columns, right? So here I'm going to make sure that this cart content should be display grid. And by default, have the grid column 1, but on the medium, screen, and more, the grid column is 2, and then the gap between the items is 4. So now if I have 2 p tag inside a cart content, now we should see 2 column, right? Cool. Let's go back in here. Basically, first we need to create this input and then the date input. Let's go back in here. We need to search for the input, basically input and label. So this is the input that we are going to use. As you can see, it's pretty simple to install that. Let's go back in the terminal and we are going to install the npx shadcn add lettuce add label and input. So let's try to hit enter. So inside a cart content, I'm going to put this div right here. As you can see, this div is basically have a label and input. So let's try to import the label from the UI and the input from the UI component. As you can see here, we have the HTML4 and ID. So the HTML4 is matched with the ID inside the input. The reason it's matched because when I click the label, as you can see here, we should see the input field. When I click the label, it should be the input should be active. As you can see, if I click it active, right? That's the reason the HTML4 and the ID should be same. And also down here, we need to create the date input. So I'm going to put a div and then just copy everything on the top right here, paste that, and then here I'm going to say the type of this input, it should be date. Save that, and as you can see, now we have date right here. Super simple. And then I'm going to change the text here, the label to the date, and also the HTML4. I'm going to do date, and then the ID, let's do date as well. Let's take a look. Here we go. Right, I can type in here, I can change the date whatever I want. Super cool. So anyway, we need to just remove the cart content p tag in here and also the cart footer component. Let's remove everything in here, and I think just the cart footer and the p tag. And also just make sure all the import in here that we don't need, just remove it. Save, and here we go. Everything should be clean. So the next thing is let's try to styling the from and to cart. I'm going to go back to the invoice form and go to contact details. So basically the UI, it should be really similar because as you can see on the final project, we have still 2 column and etc. and we use cart and etc. So anyway, the better way is we can just copy and paste from the basic details. So let's try to copy, I think just the cart in here, copy that back to contact details and just return in here. And of course, we need to import the cart header, cart title, and the cart content, label. The label should be come from the UI, and then the input should be come from the UI as well. For the cart title, we need to change that. So I'm going to say from and to. For the div right here, right, we have to change that as well. So basically, I just want to remove all this div and then just put this div with space 4, right? And then inside that, basically we have the heading 3 because as you can see on the final project, we have this heading 3 right here. So we can just copy the title, go back here, put the heading 3, and just paste the text. And then here we can add class name. I'm going to do just font medium in here. Save, let's take a look. Here we go. Right, so for example, we have 2 div in here. Now we have 2 column, right? This is from, this is to. So I'm going to go back here, copy the 2 text, go back and then just paste that here. Save, and let's take a look. Here we go. So under the heading 3, I'm going to put this div right here that have a label and input. As you can see, the HTML4 is from name, the label is name, and the placeholder is your name or company. If I save, as you can see, this is the input. Let's go back in here, and I just want to copy this one, go back to the client here, paste that, and I'm going to change this into to name for the HTML4 and for the ID. And for the placeholder, I'm going to do client. right? Client name or company. Here we go. And the next thing is let's put the email input field. I'm going to copy the div, paste in. This is basically for the email like that. This should be from email. Here we go. I'm going to paste this placeholder right here, your@email.com. And the type of this input, it should be email. Type, I believe should be email. Save, and as you can see, cool. And also for the client email, we need to just copy this one and paste that down here. Change this into to email. Or I think for the placeholder, I'm going to change that to client@email.com. Just like this. Okay, now we have the form 2 done, I think. Now let's move into the item list component. Let's go to invoice form and click the item list component. In here, I'm going to render the cart component. And then inside that, I'm going to render the cart header and also the cart content. Let's do cart header and then cart content. Inside cart header, I'm going to put the cart title, and the cart title for this item list is invoice items. Let's take a look. We have the items, we have the title of the cart. And then under in here, basically, I'm going to render a button. So this is basically button that have text add item. So let's import the button and then the plus icon from Lucid React and also this function right here. I'm going to create the function. And for now, I just want to create a empty function like this. So let's take a look. This is the add item button, right? So I like to put the button on the right side and the invoice item title here into the left side. So basically on the cart header here, we can add class name. I'm going to set the display to flex row, and item center, and justify to between. Let's take a look what we have. We cannot see the button and the title. Here we go, right? We have the title and we have the button on the right side. On the cart header, I'm going to add class name called space y24, and inside in here, basically I'm going to map through the invoice item array. So let's first create the dummy data on the top right here. So as you can see here, we have this array. This is just for example to styling. As you can see, we have item array that have an ID, description, quantity, rate, and amount. So let's try to map through these items here inside a cart content. I want to grab that items and then I'm going to do dot map. Let's grab the individual item like this, and then let's try to return another component in here. So I'm going to create a component called invoice item. So let's do invoice item like this. So let's now create the invoice item component on the component folders. Let's do invoice item.tsx. Let's do RFC and then just change the component to invoice item. And now you can just copy and import the invoice item right here. And then of course we have this error because we don't yet send the key. So the key for now, it should be item.id. So let's save that and let's take a look. We should see two invoice item that render. On these invoice items, basically I'm going to create some props. So the first thing is the item. Item should become from the individual item, and the index should become from this index right here. And also the can remove, it should become from the items.length is more than 1. So if the items.length is more than 1, the can remove, it should be true. Let's open the invoice item component. So let's take a look on the final project what we have. As you can see, basically we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, like a 5 columns, right? But I'm going to create this as a 12 column, I think. So let me just go back in here and try to put class name and display create column 12. The reason why I put 12 is I want to show you why it's 12, but the first thing is just put 12 right there, and we're going to say div, and I'm going to do 1 and just paste this couple times. Save that, and then let's go back in here. As you can see, we need to remove like 4, right? Here we go. So basically we have 12 column, right? So the first thing is we are going to make sure that the first column should be like a 5 column space, right? So in here, I'm gonna say this one it should be have class name. I'm gonna do column span 5. So this first column, first item, it should be like a 5 column. As you can see now, the result it should be look like this, right? So we need to remove like a 1, 2, 3, 4. Let's remove the 4 column. 1, 2, 3, 4. Yep. Remove that, and as you can see, that's the result. And then for the quantity, rate, and amount, as you can see, the column is same in here. So basically, it's like a 2 column. So let me just try to do last name, column, span 2 in here. Let's try to just copy this one and then paste that. All right, let's take a look at the result. Here we go. So we have 5, 2, 2, 2, and then we need to remove 3. Let's just remove that. For the last item, I'm gonna setting that as a column span 1. So I'm gonna copy this class name and then paste that in here. So this is basically column span 1, and here we go. Let's take a look in here. I think I'm going to add like a background so you can see background red 200. This is basically the, let me write here, description. And then let me just try to copy this one. I hope this is not a waste of your time, but I just like to explain this one. As you can see, this is the result, right? So that's the reason why I use 12 column, because if you increment all the column in here, it should be 12. As you can see here, 1, 3, and 5. 5 plus 2 should be 7. 7 plus 5 is 12, right? All of this is 12 column. All right, so for the first column, I'm gonna paste this input and label. As you can see here, the label should be have description, and the input, as you can see here, the value and the on change. I just want to remove that for now. Let's just focus on the UI things. As you can see here, we should see this beautiful input, but I like to just remove the background. This is just for example. For the quantity, I'm gonna put this label. As you can see, the label is quantity, and the input we type number, and the minimal value is 1. Let's take a look. This is the result, right? Oh, not this one, but this one. So this is basically the rate. As you can see, the type is number, minimal is 0, and the step is 0.01. Let me save that. Let's take a look at the result. This is the quantity, this is the rate. Super cool. So the last thing is, let's go back in here. This is basically the amount. As you can see, we have the label and this div right here that have height, padding X, padding Y, background, and etc. And the value, I just want to put that 0.00. Let me save that and let's take a look. Here we go, right? That's the amount. And for the button remove, let's try to go back in here and just, I'm gonna put this button with rest icon. As you can see, the button should become from the UI/button that have variant outline, size icon, and for this on click and disable, let me try to just, I think I'm gonna remove that for now. The rest come from the Lucid React. Save that. Let's take a look at the result. Here we go. As you can see, it's not like on the center, so let's fix that. Here I'm going to put display flags, and then I'm going to say items, it should be on the end. Save, and let's take a look. Here we go. As you can see, we have that button. So the last thing, let's create the tags and totals UI. So this is basically the final project. Let me go back to the invoice form and open the tags and total right here. So the first thing is I like to use, again, I'm gonna use card in here. Just import the card and then just import the card header and card content. So the card header, it should be have card title inside that, and the text is tags and totals. And then in here, I'm gonna put the card, let me do card content. The card content should be have this class name. As you can see, the display is grid column 1 for the medium size and more. I'm gonna set the grid column to 2, and the gap between the item, it should be 6. And inside that, let's create a div. And again, inside this div, I want to put label and input. So I'm going to paste this label and input. Let's import the label from the UI and input from the UI as well. As you can see, this label have tax and tax rate %, and the input is basically the type is number, minimal value 0, maximal 100, and step is 0.01. Let me save that. Let's take a look. And this one right here, as you can see, that's the tax rate. And also for the right side, I'm going to put another div in here. Let's do div with class name space y22. I'm gonna paste this div right here. As you can see, basically we have 3 div inside the space y2. The first div is right here. As you can see, the class name is display flex and justify between. And also we have 2 values, span and span, right? That's the subtotal. This is the value. And also the last thing is also we have the flex and justify within. This is just really same as you can see, but the difference is the last thing is using the font bold, text large, and border top, and then padding top to 2. So let's take a look at the result. Here we go. As you can see, it's super simple, but as you can see, we're done with all the UI things, right? The UI is just works. I think the last thing that I'm not touch is basically the preview. As you can see, if I click preview, it's look like that. So let's go to the preview. Let me just go to the invoice preview, and here we go. So for the invoice preview, the first thing is I'm going to add this class name right here, minimal height. I'm going to make sure the height should be screen, which is 100 view height. And also for the background, I'm going to say gray 50 and padding to 4. And inside in here, I'm going to put another div that have the maximal width into 4XL. And also I'm gonna make sure the maximal width here, it should be on the center, so I can say MX auto. So this div, it should be have class name to display flex, justify between, item center, and margin bottom to 6. And inside in here, basically I'm gonna put a heading 1. This heading 1 should be have text invoice preview. So let's take a look. This is the title. And also on the right side here, I'm gonna put the button back to the form, right? So let's do that in here, and I'm gonna say another div. I'm gonna add the space x to 2 because inside in here I'm going to put 2 buttons basically. The first thing is the back to edit button, and then next thing is the download PDF button. So let's try to import the button from the UI, and then for this function, for now I just want to remove that. So let's take a look at this function again. I just want to remove that for now. For the download icon, let's import it from the Lucid React. Let's take a look. As you can see, if I click preview, we have this button right here, right? Back to edit and download PDF. Cool. So now let's take a look to the final project here. As you can see, if I go to preview, basically, the first thing is we are going to wrapping this invoice with card component. So after this div right here, I'm going to say a card component in here. So let's do card. I'm not going to use card header in this case, just card content like this. And in this card content, I'm going to put the class name padding to 8. And inside that, I'm going to make a comment in here for the invoice header. So basically, I'm going to paste this invoice header. As you can see, we have this div with display flex, justify between, to make sure this div should be on the left and this div right here, it should be on the right side. As you can see, we have the heading 2 for the invoice text right here, and also the p tag for the code of the invoice. And in here we have this div with the date. So let's take a look at the result. Here we go. As you can see, we have the invoice text on the left and the date on the right side. Cool. That's for the invoice header. So down here, so in here, I'm going to paste this div. As you can see, this div here is basically have grid column 2. And then as you can see inside that, we have just 2 div right here with heading 3 and 2 p tag. So this is basically the from that have 2 p tag, acme, and the email. And also the 2 right here that have the name and also the email as well. So let's take a look. If I save, let's take a look in here. As you can see, we have from and then 2. I'm going to put the items table. So in here, I'm going to use table tag, all right? And inside that we have the t head for table head and t body for the table body. So let's do t head for the table heading, and then down here we have t body for the table body. So inside the table, I'm going to put this class name right here. The width, I'm going to setting that to full and margin bottom to 8. And also inside the table heading right here, I'm going to put this tr. As you can see, tr that have border bottom to, and then we have th right here, right? Description, quantity, rate, and amount. If I save that, let's take a look at the result. Here we go. As you can see on the top right here, this is basically the table heading. All right, cool. So now let's working with table body. So inside the table body, we are going to map through the items array. So I like to just get this item in here. I'm going to copy that items and then go back to invoice preview. Just paste that on the top right here. This is just for example. Now let's try to map through this items array. So let's scroll it down, and inside the t body, I'm going to do items.map, grab the individual item. And then what I'm going to return in here is tr like this. And just make sure we put the key, and key should be item.id. And also I'm going to add this class name right here, border bottom. And also inside in here, I just want to paste this td right here. As you can see, the first is the item.description, because the first table or the first column is description. That's why in here I show the item.description. And also the next thing is the item.quantity, because the second column should be quantity. And also in here, basically this is just checking if the type of item.read is number, render item.read to fixed to right here, or just put 0.00 and then just that's it. Super simple. Let's try to take a look at the result. Here we go. Right, that's the invoice look like. So the next thing is I'm going to render the totals of the invoice. So let's scroll down in here. After the table, I'm going to put the totals. So anyway, I just want to paste this div right here. As you can see, this div have a display flex and justify n. To make sure all this div should be placed on the right side. And also I want to make sure the width is 64 and the space y22 to make sure all this div should have space y2. And as you can see, this is just super simple that have subtotals and the value and the label and value and label and value. And for the total, I'm just adding this font bold, text large, border top, and padding top to 2. Let's try to saving that. Let's take a look at the result. Here we go. Right, that's the totals. So anyway, we're done with all the UI stuff, right? If I refresh, it should be show the form. And then if I click preview, now we're on the preview of that invoice. So I think the UI is done. So now let's try to working with the functionality of the invoice generator. So the first thing that I like to do is I'm going to create the type of the invoice. So let's try to just close everything. And on the root here, I'm going to create folder called types and then slash invoice.ts file. And then I just want to paste this type right here. So as you can see, for the invoice item, this is basically the item of the invoice right here. As you can see, we have description, quantity, rate, and amount, right? So this is basically the type: ID, description, quantity, number or string, rate, number or string, and amount is number. That's for the invoice item. And also we have the invoice data. It's basically all of this that you can see right here, like a invoice number, date, and etc. As you can see, the invoice number is string, date is string, from name is a string, from email to name to email. Items is basically come from the invoice item on the top right here. And we have tax rate, subtotal, tax amount, and the total. So that's for the type of the invoice. So the next thing is I'm going to create like a global state. So any component inside a component folder or page right here can access that value. So I'm going to create context API in this case. So let's create folder called context, right? And inside that, it should be folder. So I'm going to remove that. And then let's try to do context folder. And inside the context folder, I'm going to create invoice-context. .tsx. So first I'm going to create the context. As you can see here, using create context, come from the create context should come from React. Here we go. And the invoice context type, let's create that interface on the top right here. Interface, call that invoice context type. And in here, for now, I just want to put invoice, and the type of the invoice is going to be invoice data come from the type / invoice. So next we need to create the invoice provider. So I'm going to export a function. I'm going to call this invoice provider. And this function, it should be return the invoice context.provider. So let's do invoice context.provider like this. And then basically we need to grab the children in here. So let's do children. The children, it should be have type. Let's do children. And the type of this is going to be React Node. So now we need to put the children in here. It should be inside the invoice context.provider. But as you can see in here, we get an error because we need to send a value basically. So we can do value, and then in here we need to send data. So the first thing is I'm going to create state in here. So I'm going to create state called invoice, because we're using use state in here. Of course, this component, it should be client component. So we can do use client on the top here. As you can see, now we can send this invoice to this value. As you can see, we have this error. It say type invoice data or undefined is not assignable to type invoice context type, because in here we put the invoice as a key, right? Key of this object. So that's why in here we should put an object, and then the key is invoice, and then the value is invoice. Because we have same of name right here, it's fine to just put invoice like this. So next I'm going to create like initial invoice data on this invoice state in here. So let's try to create these data on the constant. I'm going to create that inside the lib folder, create file called constants.ts, and then just paste this initial invoice data that have type invoice data, right? Come from the type / invoice. And the default value for the invoice is the invoice number. As you can see, it's basically env dash the date now, and the date is basically date now. The from name is empty, 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 and the item is just one item in here with ID 1, description empty, quantity 1, rate 0, amount 0. The tax rate by default is 10, and another thing is 0. So now let's try to import these variable to the invoice context like this. And here we go. So now we get the default value on the invoice. And now let's try to get the invoice provider invoice context in here to access on any component. So the way we do that is we have to wrapping our layout. Let's go to app and then layout here with invoice provider. So let's wrap the body in here with invoice provider like this. Let's put all of this inside that invoice provider. Here we go. Cool. So now what we are going to do is I'm going to create like a hook that will help me to basically get the value from the context API. So let's go back to invoice context, and down here, I'm going to create a function called use invoice. And this function is basically get the use context and then paste the invoice context. And as you can see, if there's no if the context is equal to undefined, just throw this error. Use invoice must be used within an invoice provider. And then if the context is have a value, just return that context right here. Okay, cool. So now let's try to get that value on, for example, let's do on the page.tsx, or I think let's just grab that inside the component and then basic details. This basically, we are going to get the invoice number value, right? So here I'm going to say cons, just put data like this that equals to use invoice, right? Just make sure we import that like this. So let's try to console log that data just to see what we have on that data. I'm going to inspect, go to console, and then as you can see, we have this object right here. I hope you can see that. Right, we have the invoice date from email, invoice number, and etc. So at least we get the data, right? That's pretty cool. So now in here, we can destructuring the invoice just like this. So now I'm going to put the value of the invoice number in here. So the value should equals to invoice.invoice number. So if I save that, you will see the value. I'm going to refresh this one, and as you can see, it's just becoming the default value of the invoice number. Super cool. And also we can set the default value for the date right here. So let's put the value set equals to invoice.date. And now we should see the value right here, right? So anyway, this error is because we're not adding any on chains on the input. Because now if I typing something inside an input field, nothing will be happen because we don't yet put the on change event on this input right here. So now let's handle the on change. So basically we are going to create another function for update the invoice. So let's go back to the invoice context in here. And then for the invoice context type, I'm going to add another in here, which is function called update invoice. And it's like a property called updates, right? And this function is just returning void. So let's create this function. So in here, I'm going to say const update invoice set equals to arrow function. And then basically inside this props, what I'm going to do, let's just copy everything in here. These updates, right? It's like a update props, and the type of this update is basically partial of the invoice data type. And inside this function, I'm going to create variable called a new invoice and put the invoice value before updated. So this is the updated value will override the old value inside the invoice, right? So now what we can do, you can say set invoice into this new invoice. So just like this. So now we can send the update invoice into this value. If we sending like this, so now we can access the update invoice to the use invoice, which is right here. We can just access that like that. So now let's try to handle the on chains in here. So as you can see, I adding this on chains prop in this input. And then it's basically will running the update invoice and send this object right here. Invoice number, the value it should be changed based on the e.target.value. Super cool. So now for the date, let's do that as well in here. For the date, we are going to make sure what the change in here is the date. Right? Date it should be equals to e.target.value. Save that and let's take a look. I'm going to change the value here, and now as you can see it works, right? If I change the date, of course it should be works as well. So basically that's what we are going to do on the contact detail as well. So let's open the contact details right here, and we are going to import the use invoice, right? Just copy this one and just paste that right here. Just make sure we import the use invoice. So first for the from name, what I'm going to do is just paste this value and on change. As you can see, the value should become from the invoice.from name, and the on change should be running the update invoice and change the from name value into the e.target.value. So now as you can see, of course, I can update that value. And if I console log the invoice, we should see the value, it should be updated. As you can see in here, if I typing just random something in here, random, you should see random value on the form name. Okay, super cool. So now let's update the email. Let's scroll it down a little bit. This one right here for the from email, I'm going to put the value should become from the invoice.from email, and the on change should be change the from email. So let's scroll it down again. Let's go to the name of the client in here, and I'm going to send this. The value should be invoice.toName, and the on change it should be running the update invoice to name set equals to e.target.value. For the to email, we are going to send the value and on change as well. So as you can see, the value should be come from the invoice.toEmail. The on change it should be changed the to email into e.target.value. Super simple. If you follow along this tutorial, I hope you will understand what's going on in here. Let's try to change something in here, and now as you can see, all the value is updated inside the invoice context. All right, so now we are gonna working with the items, right? The items right here invoice items. So let's go to invoice item list, I believe. Yeah, item list. Remember, on the item list, basically we create dummy data, right? Should be not come from dummy data. It should be come from the context data that we already create right here, right? As you can see, the invoice data right here should be have items. So this is basically the invoice items. So let's close this one. And then let's go back in here. Basically, I'm going to grab the cons, destructuring the invoice, come from the use invoice, or yeah, use invoice. And then here we can just grab the invoice.item right here, invoice.items, and then map through that value. So let's take a look what we have. As you can see, we have just one items in here. If you go back to your constant, if you want to add another items in here, for example, I'm going to copy this object, paste that. Now we should see two data, right? Just remove that. That's just for example. So anyway, what we're going to do now is let's create the add item. So add item should be also come from the use invoice like this. So now let's try to go back to the context, and we need to create add item function. So anyway, under the update invoice function, I'm going to create the add item function. As you can see, this add item function is basically super simple. The first thing is we create new item variable, and then this type should be invoice item. The ID it should be date now to string, description 0, quantity 1, rate 0, and amount 0. As you can see, it is basically the value in here, the default value from the invoice item. And then finally, we update the invoice, and the item, we're setting that the old invoice.item, and we add new item right here. So let's send the add item into the value here, so we can access that on the item list right here, add item. So anyway, we get this error. The reason is because we don't yet update the invoice context type. So in here, we need to add the add item function. So anyway, the function is just super simple, add item function, and just returning void. Super cool. So now let's try to just remove these items first, right? Remove that. And now let's try to see, should be the invoice items, invoice.items.length, and then I'm going to add items. As you can see, now we have 2, 3, 4, and etc. It's working, but now the delete is not works. As you can see here, we don't yet handle that delete. So anyway, the delete is inside the invoice item component right here. So first we need to grab the props of this invoice item. As you can see here, we can grab the item, the index, and can remove. So let's create the invoice item props in here. So I'm going to do interface called invoice item props. So the item here, it should be have type invoice item, but I just changed the name here into invoice item because the invoice item type is same with the component name. So I just changed that as a invoice item type is fine. So in here, we also need to import the use invoice hooks, right? And we are going to use the remove item function. We don't yet have that function. So let's go back to the context, and we have to create that function. So here I want to say cons remove item set equals to an arrow function. So this function, it should be take a props called index, and this should be a number, right? So how the remove item works is super simple. As you can see, remove item is take a index as a parameter. And then on the invoice item, remember we have the index as a props in here. So we can send that when we click the button remove. When I click this button, I'm going to send the remove item, run the remove item function, and send the index. So the index in here is basically what we are going to remove. And that's why in here we filter that, right? And update the invoice data with the new items after I delete it. So now let's send the remove item into the value. Remove item set equals to remove item, but we have an error because we don't send remove item as a type at the top right here. So let's send the remove item. This basically take an index as a parameter, and that index should be number and returning void. As you can see now, it's clean. Super cool. Now let's try to use the remove item function on this button. So as you can see, I just sent two property on the button component. The first thing is the on click. When I click the button, it should be running the remove item and send the index as a parameters. And the button should be disabled if the can remove is false. Right, so let's try to remove that. And then I think I'm going to add another item in here. As you can see, we have 3 items. So now if I, for example, let's try to do 1, 2, and 3, right? If I remove 2, now it works. Now we have just 1 and 3. If I remove the 1, now we have just 3. Super cool. It works. So now we need to handle the value and the on change on this each input. Description input and this quantity input and etc. So for the description, the value should become from the item.description, and the onChange event will running the update item function. We don't yet have this function, right? So let's create that on the context. So first I'm grabbing that from the use invoice, and as you can see, the update item is like index description as a key right here and send the value. So let's go back to the context, and we're going to create that function in here. So the function name, it should be update item set equals to arrow function. So the parameter of this update item is basically index, field, and value. Index, it should be a number, right? The field is key of invoice item, because invoice item, as you can see here, have a ID, description, quantity, rate. This is basically the key. So that's why I set the key right here. The field is key of invoice item. It can be description, quantity, and etc. And the value can be string or number. The reason I'm setting this as a string or number is because when I remove, I want the default value is empty, right? That's why this is string, and I can type in like a 12, 23, that's number. So that's why the value of the quantity and rate in here is basically string or number. So first I'm going to store all the invoice.items value on the new items variable. So now what I'm going to do is let's just try to console log the new items. And then I'm going to send the update item on this value. And then just make sure we also update the type of the invoice contact type. So this should be the update item that have an index field value, right? Super cool. So now we can use that update item to anywhere we want. So let's open the invoice item component. As you can see in here, we're running the update item on this input of the description and send the index description as a key in here and the value when we update that description field. So now let's try to typing, for example, A. As you can see, now we have this array, right? So anyway, the value is not updated. The reason is because we just console log that and not doing anything with the new, let me see, new items, right? So what we're going to do in here is we need to update the new items index based on the value that we're typing. So I'm going to put this new items, grab the specific index, and then in here, put this object. And as you can see, it is basically the old value from the new items index, and then put this new value, put the field, and then put the value. And then down here, just make sure after we set the new item index into new value, what we're going to do is we need to make sure we run the update invoice. So let's do update invoice into items, grab the items key, and then setting that value into new items. So let's try. Here, I'm going to update the description. As you can see, I can typing that. If I maybe console log that, of course, we should see the value updated in here. So let's do update. And then you can see here, we have the description update on the top right here. Okay, that works. So now we need to do the same thing on the quantity. Let's go back on the invoice item. And I just want to copy this value and on change, go to the input of the quantity and just paste that like this. Just make sure this should be quantity and just send the key right here as a quantity. Save that and let's take a look. If I refresh, let's typing something in here, we can do that. But as you can see, yeah, we can do that anyway. Let's try to see here. Yep, we have the quantity as a string in here, but I like the quantity should be number because I'm going to increment that quantity and rate and etc. and show the total down here, right? So that's why I'm going to change the string in here into the number. So the way we do that is, anyway, I'm going to create another function to handle that. So instead of running the update item in this input, I'm going to running the handle quantity change and send the edo target of value. So the handle quantity change is basically my custom function in here. So let's do const handle quantity change set equals to arrow function. So this function should be like a parameter value as a string, right? This basically will allow empty string temporary, but convert to number for calculation. So we have to convert the value into the number to calculation basically. So as you can see, if the value is string, I'm going to run the update item quantity into string. Else I'm going to do const num value, is basically will parse the value into number, right? Because now we have value on the input field in here, right? This is number. Basically we cannot typing a, b, c, etc. So we can just typing a number, and then I'm going to change that into the number type in here. And finally we check that down here, right? If the num value is number and the num value is more than equal to 0, I'm running update items and the index, quantity, and num value. This is basically the value with number type. So if I typing 23, for example, let's take a look what happened. As you can see, we have 23 as a number in here. So if I remove, I hope we can still see quantity empty string. Cool. If I do 0, it should be number. Let's take a look. As you can see, the quantity is number. That's what I want. Super cool. And also I like to, when I remove, for example, the quantity, I'm going to remove that, right? That now it's empty. If I click outside the quantity field, it should be show 1 as a default value. So we're going to use onBlur to do that. So here, let's go back into the input of this type number quantity. I'm going to send this onBlur set equals to handle quantity blur. And then let's try to create the function on the top right here. As you can see, handle quantity blur set equals to arrow function. So this is basically if empty on blur set to 1. So if the item quantity is empty string or item quantity is 0, it's basically will update the item to 1. So let's take a look. Here, I'm going to just make sure I typing 12 or whatever. I can remove that. And now as you can see, it's empty, right? So if I click outside the quantity input field, now it's 1. Super, super cool. If I do 0, if I click outside the input field, now it's becoming 1. That's super, super handy on blur functionality in here, so definitely you have to use that. So next, let's working with the rate. Let's scroll down. As you can see here, we have the rate, right? And I'm gonna send the same in here, the value, the on change, and the on blur. Value should be come from the item.rate, and the on change should be running handle red change, and the on blur is handle red blur. So let's first create the handle red change in here. So anyway, I just want to paste this handle red change. As you can see, again, this basically will allow empty string temporarily, but convert the number to calculation. As you can see, if the value is 0, update item index rate into empty string. And also is check if the number is have a type number and the number is more than equal to 0, is basically update the item index rate into num value. That's it. And the next thing is we need to create the handle red blur function as well. So I'm gonna paste this handle red blur. As you can see, if the item.rate is empty string, I'm going to run the update item index rate into 0. That's the default value. So let's try to refresh just to make sure everything should be clean. So now as you can see, if I typing, for example, 12, if I click outside, oh no, I mean, I'm going to remove that and I'm going to click outside the input rate. Now it's becoming 0. That's super, super cool. So the next thing is, let's try to scroll down. So anyway, I'm going to change this amount value in here into the, first I'm going to check if the type of item.amount is number. I'm going to fix that to right here, or else just put 0.00. So let's save that. Let's take a look. As you can see, we have 000. Cool. So that's for the invoice item. I believe it works. So now let's try to move to the tax and totals. So anyway, I forget the important thing in here, which is the amount. It should be updated, as you can see in here. If I typing, for example, quantity 1, the rate is 10, the amount it should be updated, right? Like a $10 in here. So anyway, we don't have the input field in here, so we can update the amount value into the context anyway. So in here, when we update that item right here, right, we are going to update also the amount value. So I'm going to remove the console log in here and check. Or anyway, I just want to paste this condition and I'm going to explain that. As you can see, that's the condition. And we have this error because we're using let. So I'm going to remove that and try to use cons, right? It's fine. So as you can see, if the field is equal to quantity and the field is equal to rate, that means if this is updated, right? If this is updated, this condition will running. And then the first thing is I'm going to get the quantity value, new item index and quantity, rate value, rate item index rate. That's how we get the value of the quantity value and rate value. And then in here, this is basically we'll check if the quantity value is string or number, right? It just changes that to the number. Basically, if string, just make sure it's 0, and else just make sure the quantity value is number. Super simple. And finally, we have the quantity number value. And finally, in here, we have the rate value as a number. And then finally down here, this is really important. This is the part that the amount is updated, and we can do new items, get the specific index. The reason is index right here because we have some items, right? And this is basically corresponding with the where we typing. For example, I typing on right here, the index should be 1. If I typing on the top, the index should be 0. Cool. So now we update the amount set equals to quantity times the rate. Okay, so now let's save that. Let's take a look at the result. Here, if I typing 1 for the quantity and the rate is 10, we have $10. If I do 100, we have $100. Let's do 99. Let's do quantity to 4, for example, and we have that value, right? It worked basically. Super cool. So now let's move to the tax and totals component. So let's go back, and I think I'm going to close everything in here. There's a lot of component that open. So now let's just open the tax and total, and also let's open the context file. Cool. So it's what is that? This one right here. So first we need to import the use invoice, and I'm going to get the invoice data and the update invoice function. So let's go to the tax rate input field, and I'm going to send the value, the on change, and the on blur. All right, this is basically that I send. So let's create the handle tax rate change function, and also we need to create the handle tax rate blur function. So here I want to copy and paste the function. This is basically the handle tax rate change is take a value as a parameters. It's basically string, and this condition is basically will allow empty string temporarily. And if the value is empty, as you can see, the tax rate should be empty, and else is basically make sure the value should be changed to number, and then check the number in here, and then finally put the value num value into the tax rate, and that's it. Super simple. And for the handle tax blur is what happened in here if the empty on blur set to 0, right? Super simple. Let's try to take a look. If I remove that value, as you can see now, this just empty string, right? If I click outside, it should be becoming 0%. That's super cool. All right, it works. So now let's move to the down here on the subtotal. This is basically the calculation that we are gonna put. So what we are gonna put in here is basically the subtotal, and I'm gonna say to fix 2 in here. So let's try to save that, and as you can see, the subtotal is 0. So let's try to do 12, and the tax rate is 10, for example. As you can see, the subtotal is not updated. So how we can update the subtotal value, where we have to update that. So anyway, if you take a look on the tax rate input field, this is will running the handle tax rate change, right? And that function is running update invoice. So anyway, we have to change this value, subtotal value, into this update invoice function. So let's go back to context, and then inside the update invoice function, basically we have to add this condition. As you can see in here, this if condition right here is running calculation total. So let's just create that first. So on the root, let's create the utils folder. And inside that, I'm going to create calculations.ts file, right? And then just paste this function. Okay, so let's go back to context, and then we are going to import the calculation tools. So in this condition, the first I check is basically the update.items. So this is basically everything I typing on the invoice item. If I typing the description, this should be have a value, right? If I change the quantity or rate, that should be have a value, right? So, or the update tax rate is not undefined. It means this should be have a value. All right, if this condition is true, I'm gonna get the subtotal and tax amount and total from the calculate totals. So this function is like a two parameters, basically update items or invoice item. This is basically the old value, this is basically the new value. It's same, right? And also take a tax rate. If the update tax rate is not undefined, using update tax rate, but if the update tax rate is undefined, using invoice tax rate. Super simple, but anyway, the important thing is that calculate totals just like a two parameters, item and tax rate. And also finally in here, I create subtotal variable and running items.reduce and get the sum and item. So this anyway is basically just increment all the amount that I have on the items. So anyway, let's take a look on the example in here. This is the amount, right? $23. If I add another item, let's do 10 for example. So this subtotal variable will increment all amount that I have. As you can see, 23 plus 10, it should be 33. All right, that's why the subtotal here, all right, it should be 33. And then the rate is basically the value on the tax rate right here. And it's just really simple. Check if number using tax rate, if string using 0, right? Just super simple condition. And then finally, the tax amount is subtotal, right? The subtotal of the amount times by rate and divided by 100. That's for the tax amount. And for the total is subtotal plus tax amount. And then finally return that down here. Super simple. So, and finally, we get the subtotal, tax amount, and total, right? And then new invoice.subtotal, setting that to new value from the subtotal, and then new invoice.tax amount into tax amount from the calculation totals, and new invoice.total set equals to total from the calculation totals, right? I hope it's not confused. Okay, cool. So now let's take a look. So as you can see, the subtotal is updated, right? If I change the rate to 99, now we have the subtotal $122. It works, by the way. So next, let's go back to the tax and totals, and we are going to update the tax right here. So I'm going to paste this. As you can see here, the tax, it should become from the invoice tax rate, right? If the invoice tax rate number using that value or using just 0. And then down here for the total, I'm gonna get the value from the invoice.total.toFix2, right? Save that and let's take a look. Now we have the tax is $12.20 and for the total is $134.20. So anyway, the functionality of this invoice generator is work. But if I go back to preview, as you can see, it's not updated right here. So we have to make sure that the data that I typing on the form is updated on the preview as well. But as you can see on the back to edit here, it's not yet working. So now let's working with the preview. Let's go to invoice preview. So first I'm going to send property on this invoice preview component. So we can click the go back button. So first let's go to page.tsx and on the invoice preview, I'm going to send this on back props. Right, when I click the on back, it should be set the show preview back to false anyway. Let's save that and let's go back to invoice preview. and we are going to grab that props. So in here, I'm going to grab the onBack function, and we have this invoice preview props. So I'm going to create the interface on the top right here, as you can see. Cool. So now when I click this back to edit, what I'm going to do is just running the onBack. So let's try to do that. Here it works basically. Okay, super cool. So now we need to get all the invoice data from the use invoice come from the context, right? So let's grab that in here. Here we go. Let's import the use invoice like this. So next we need to update the invoice number into the invoice.invoice number. It's come from the context, right? And also we need to update the date basically. But first I like to create the formatters function, right? So let's go to utils, and then inside that I'm going to create another function in here called formatters. And then I'm going to paste these two functions, format date and format currency. Really simple function. And let's try to use that function on this date right here. So let's remove that. And then I'm going to say format date. And then let's try to put the invoice.date. Just like that. Let's take a look at the result. And let's go to preview. Here we go. Right? We have this beautiful format. So next, let's update the name right here. So let's go back, and then for the name, I'm going to render the invoice from name, and then for the email, it should be invoice.from email. So let's also update the two right here, the client detail, right? It should be invoice.to name. And also invoice.toEmail down here. And also for the table body, basically we are going to render the invoice, right, .items.map. So let's take a look what happened in here. All right, so I think this is fine. So let's try to go back to the form, and then let's try to put a website, the rate, I'm going to say 99, for example, right? And then let's go back to preview. Let's take a look. We have that value. Okay, super cool. It works. So let's move down. For the subtotal in here, I'm going to paste this value, invoice.subtotal.toFix2, right? And also for the text and the value, I'm going to paste this value right here. As you can see, this text, it should become from the invoice.text, right? If number, using invoice.rate. If not number, just use 0%. And also invoice.text amount to fix to. The total, it should be come from the invoice.total. Let's save all of that. Let's take a look at the result. Here we go. We have $108.90. Let's go back in here. Let's update the name of the company, Acme. Let's do John Doe, for example. Just random things in here. Let's try to change the rate to maybe 6%. Add another item. Let's do portfolio. Quantity 2, the rate is 99. I don't know, let's say 23, for example. As you can see, that's the total, right? 15D. Let's take a look at the preview. We have the same value. All right, this is the invoice working, super nice. The next thing what we are going to working on is the download PDF right here, right? Because now it's not working, of course. So let's try to go back to the invoice preview, and let's take a look where this button download PDF, this one right here. So I'm going to add on-click event in this button, and I'm going to run function called handle download PDF. And let's try to create that function in here, const handle download PDF set equals to error function. And this function is basically will run another function. So I'm going to call this generate PDF like this. And this function, it should be send the invoice data. Here we go. So now we need to create the generate PDF function. Let's go to utils. Let's create a file. I'm going to call this PDF generator.tsx. And then just create a const PDF generate PDF function set equals to an arrow function. All right. So this function, it should be export, so we can use that. Export like this. So let's try to import that function in here. As you can see, it's like an invoice. So we have to grab it in here, invoice. So the type of this invoice, it should be invoice data come from the type /invoice. So let's take a look. I just want to see if I console log invoice, what happened. So let's do console log invoice. Let's try to open the console and I just want to click the download PDF. As you can see, that's all the data that we have, right? So let's try to create the PDF. So anyway, we are going to use package called jsPDF. And as you can see, this is super popular package, right? So I'm going to copy that, npm install, and paste that right here. npm install jsPDF. And I think the better way to render PDF before we download that file is we can just preview that PDF, right? So we can change the text or whatever we want on that PDF before we download that. So anyway, in here, the first thing is let's try to see what we can do. So first, we are going to import the jsPDF from jsPDF package on the top right here. Here we go. And then finally, we need to create the docs right here. So I'm going to copy and just paste that inside the function const doc equals to new jsPDF. And I'm going to create variable let y set equals to 30. This is basically the coordinate of the vertical. By default, I'm going to setting that to 30. So anyway, the first thing is I'm going to put, I think I just want to generate the file in here so we can see the file in preview on this project. So we can use this function in here, right? PDF blob set equals to doc.output as a blob. And then we can return URL create object URL PDF blob. This is just to preview, right? Later on, we are going to delete that. So just make sure we're doing this. And then finally go back to invoice preview. And then what I'm going to do, let's try to const URL set equals to generate PDF. And then I'm going to create another state on the top right here. I'm going to call that PDF URL, import the useState because we're using useState. I'm going to change this component to the client component. So let's do use client, right? And then what we are going to do next is I'm going to set the PDF URL into this URL const set PDF URL into the URL come from the state. It should be not const, but just set PDF URL into URL. Right, and then next we need to render the PDF URL value. I'm going to render that in here. So if the PDF URL have a value, I'm going to render this div with margin top, border, rounded, and etc. And I'm going to render the PDF URL inside the iframe with source PDF URL. Width is 100% and the height is 600 pixel. So let's take a look at the result. And then let's try to click preview, download PDF. As you can see here, we have that preview, right? So now it's just a blank, right? It's just a blank PDF right here. All right, so now let's just try to add text inside this blank document. Go back in here and then first thing first, I'm going to set the title. As you can see here, this is for the title. And I'm going to set the doc.set font size. This is basically the font size of the invoice. I'm going to set that font size, this invoice to 24. 20 is basically the X position. The Y is basically 30. And then next thing is the text right here. All right, the invoice number. I'm going to set the font size to 12. And then the X is 150 pixel. The Y is 30, right? And then here I just increment the Y position to 20. So anyway, let's take a look at the result. Here I'm going to click the download PDF again. And as you can see, this is the result. So anyway, the invoice is 20 pixel from the left. And the number of the invoice is 150 pixel from the left. That's why it's moved that right here. If I change that, for example, like 5D, now of course it should be like right here, right? I hope you can understand what happened in here. The reason this Y is increment by 20, now the Y should be 5D, right? That is because the next text, it should be under the invoice. I hope you understand that. And then in here, let's put the date. So in here, I add text inside the docs, right? This is the text. And then I put it as a 150 pixel. So it means it's under this number right here. Basically, let's take a look. I'm gonna click that, and here we go, it's right here. So let's add the contact details down here. I'm gonna put from /2. As you can see, the font size is 14 from the text from and text to in here. The X is 20, it should be on the left, and 2 right here is 120, it should be on the right side. Let's take a look at the result. Here we go, we have from and to. And then the next thing is I'm going to put the value, the invoice from name, and invoice to name, invoice from email, invoice to email. So let's take a look at the result. I believe I don't yet save that. Let's take a look. Oh, I think the problem is because I'm not adding any value in here. So now let's just put random things. So let's try to do that. Preview and then download PDF. As you can see here, we have the value, right? For now, it's fine to put just random string like this. So now I'm gonna put the items header. So this is the item headers. As you can see, the font size I'm setting that to 10, and then put the description text, quantity text, rate, and amount. As you can see, the X position is 20, 120, 140, 160. So this is becoming like table, right? And then increment the Y to put another line in here into the bottom. And then we also decrement the Y to make sure the next text issued under the items header. So let's save that. Let's take a look. And here we go. We have the description, quantity, rate, and amount. And we have this line right here because we do doc.line. So the next thing is let's adding the items. So here I'm going to map through the invoice.items. For each, we grab the individual item, and then finally we're doing text. We're adding this item.description, put the X position, and basically the idea is super same like we're doing on the top, right? It's just same. And then finally we increment the Y position to put the doc.line in here. So let's take a look at the result, and here we go. You have this table, super clean. And then finally, let's put the totals down here. So anyway, I'm gonna paste these totals. As you can see, I create a subtotals text with the X position is 140 from the left, and this text as well, the position 160 from the left, and etc. All right, this is super simple. And let's take a look how the result look like. As you can see here, we have this value. That's basically how we can working with the preview before we download that. So anyway, we can download that from here. I believe it works. Let's click that. As you can see, we can download it, but I like to download from here. So that's why I think I just want to comment these things right here so you can see the code on the GitHub. And the next thing is I'm going to download the document. So in here, I'm going to say doc.save, and the file name, I'm going to put invoice dash the number of the invoice.pdf. All right, so let's go back to invoice preview, and then in here, I just want to comment that. Let's go back on the top. Let's remove the, I just want to comment that. I think it's fine. And the use client as well. Let's scroll it down, and this one right here, I just want to run the generate PDF just like this. And of course, these items, we don't need that. Let's delete it. Here we go. Let's try to refresh, and just to make sure everything should be clean, and let's try to change the date. For example, 9 July. For the name, I'm going to say Acme or maybe Chandev. And the email, which is my email. And then the name of my client, let's do John. And the email of John is john@mail.com. And then description, let's do portfolio website. The rate is $99. Let's add another item. This is for the, let me shop or whatever, the quantity one. The rate is $1,000. Let's do the tax rate is 9, and then let's try to preview, right? This is the preview look like, and then I can click download PDF, and as you can see, this is the PDF, right? It works basically, super cool. So that's for this video, guys, and I hope you learn a lot of things from this project. You can generate the PDF right here with jsPDF package, and yep, you can just deploy the project on Vercel or whatever you want. Thank you so much, guys, for watching. I'm really appreciate if you want to like this video.